At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
When India became independent in 1947, India's military was 100% Western made. However, by 2022, Moscow had become India's top defense supplier. We've heard a lot about India's dependence on Russian weapons over the last year, but not so much about how India pivoted from being an entirely Western-made military to a Russian-made one. In his memoirs, former Foreign Secretary Y.D. Gundevia recounts how this momentous shift in India's foreign and defense policy took place. In 1947, India's military largely made use of British weapons and equipment. For more than 15 years after independence, this remained the case. In 1962, the Indian Air Force flew UK-made Hunters, Gnats, and Canberra bombers. The Army used Britain's Centurion tanks, and the INS Vikrant, which was the Indian Navy's first aircraft carrier, was also bought from Britain. Despite the strong defense relationship, there were problems with Western defense sales to India. First, the West was actively arming Pakistan, which had signed a military partnership agreement with the United States in 1954. While India warned the West that Pakistan would use these weapons against India, the West dismissed New Delhi's concerns. This caused tensions between India and its defense suppliers in Britain and the United States. While Pakistan received a flood of Western weapons on favorable terms, India on the other hand felt shortchanged by the West. We were forced into buying arms, gun for gun and aircraft for aircraft in hard cash at the cost of everything else in our low-powered economy, Gundevia said. These tensions had their origin in India's larger non-aligned foreign policy during the Cold War. America's President Eisenhower and his top diplomats took a with us or against us approach to diplomacy. Because India had not explicitly aligned with America in the Cold War, political disagreements between the two countries had become an irritant in bilateral ties. Meanwhile, Pakistan had agreed to align itself completely with the West in its war on communism, and as a result, it received a steady flow of Western weapons. Western defense supplies could also be unreliable. A key example was Britain's Canberra bombers, which India bought in 1957. Halfway through negotiating the deal to buy the bombers, Britain told India that it could not sell the bombs to go with the Canberras, since they were on a NATO secret list. A furious India then threatened to cancel the deal, after which the UK informed Delhi that the bombs were, miraculously, no longer on the secret list. Y.D. Gundevia recounts that from aircraft to submarines, Western powers were increasingly unwilling to sell India defense equipment in the 1950s and 60s. And that's where the Soviets came in. Gundevia, who later became India's foreign secretary, recounts that India wasn't initially sure about working with the Soviets. Nehru or no Nehru, the bureaucracy in New Delhi was suspicious of the Russians. Less than half a dozen of us had by then gone anywhere near Moscow, he said of India in the 1950s. But then the 1962 war between India and China took place, where India's military suffered serious setbacks. The West, on which India was dependent for weapons, provided a limited amount of support. However, the supply was unlikely to continue. The US ambassador was, in 1963, making it clear to us categorically that we should not ever hope to get enough war material from them to throw the Chinese aggressors out of Aksai Chin in the northeast. At best, we were clearly told, we might hope for just enough help to defend ourselves a little better in case of any repetition of Chinese incursions of the kind we had suffered the year before, Gundevia said about 1963. This led India to turn towards the Soviet Union for defense supplies. For example, after the defeat in the 1962 war, India wanted to improve connectivity to Ladakh in case China tried to fight another war. So it asked to purchase America's C-130 transport aircraft. Despite selling these planes to Pakistan, America was unwilling to sell to India. US Ambassador John Galbraith told the Indians that the planes were too expensive for India and hummed and hawed about a sale. Left with no choice, India bought the Soviet-made AN-12s. America also lectured India about cost when it tried to buy the F-104 supersonic fighter, but sold it to Pakistan instead despite that country's financial difficulties. So, Gundevia says, India went out and bought the Soviet MiG-21 fighter, which remains a key component of India's air power to this day. The Soviets didn't ask India for political support in the Cold War, while the West always pushed for India's backing in its battle against communism. Gundevia records travelling to Yugoslavia as secretary to President Radhakrishnan in 1965. India had then just fought the 1965 war with Pakistan, and the United States had imposed an arms embargo on both India and Pakistan. During the war, India's stock of British-made Centurion tanks had declined, and it needed new tanks. But cut off from its Western arms suppliers, India requested T-54 tanks from Yugoslavia. During the visit, Gundevia made the request to the country's defense minister, and he responded, "You want T-54 tanks? There are none on our assembly lines just now, but we will pick them up from the fields, Mr. Secretary, and send them to you as fast as we can." The Indians, Gundevia recalls, were floored at the offer after dealing with the West. "A gesture like this, behavior like this, conduct like this, makes a big difference inevitably," he said. Soviet flexibility on terms and their unwillingness to push India to take sides in the Cold War built trust between the two sides. India's army predominantly uses Russian tanks even to this day. The story, pulled largely from Gundevia's memoirs, illustrates that India's defense dependence on Russia wasn't really part of a tilt towards the USSR in the Cold War. The West's unreliable behavior, its backing of Pakistan, and its unwillingness to sell India the defense equipment it needed pushed Delhi towards the Soviets. That is how Russia became India's closest defense partner.